Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Islam in the Middle Ages. This is a series for IHSHG, examining the Islamic world from Muhammad to the Mughal Empire. In today's episode, we're going to be departing from the usual timeline to have a look at one of the biggest cultural phenomena of the Islamic world, the poetry and literature of medieval Persia. We'll be diving today into the poems and texts that help shape the culture of the Islamic world. Works that are as treasured here as figures such as Shakespeare and Cervantes in the West. This is the first in a two-part series that will first look at the secular literature of the Islamic world and then dive into the world of Sufi and wisdom literature next time. I'm very excited to be sharing this with you today. It is, in my opinion, one of the most incredible subjects in Islamic history, with a real treasure trove of unique and wonderful works to study. We'll learn about poems that use drunkenness as an analogy for spiritual enlightenment, romantic works that celebrated same-sex relationships, the Islamic rendition of Alexander the Great's story, and many more tales of love, war, and wisdom. This has been a real pleasure to research, and I hope you'll thoroughly enjoy today's episode as we explore this fascinating area of Islamic art and culture. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of the IHSHG, and I would like to thank them for giving me the platform to be able to host this. If you enjoy today's content and you haven't already, please do consider liking and subscribing, as well as checking out our YouTube channel, Facebook and Spotify for more historical content in English and Portuguese. Also, going ahead, I'm going to try to make these episodes a little shorter and better catered to individuals who are new to Islamic history, as I feel this will be a good way to make the podcast more accessible to a wider audience. Please do reach out and let me know what you think of this new way of doing things, and if you have any other feedback on how you're finding the series so far. Your ideas will be well received and help me deliver even better content as a result. So, to begin then, why study the poetry of medieval Persia? In my opinion, medieval Persian literature is the real hidden gem of Islamic culture. Unless you're from the region or have studied it yourself, you're unlikely to know names such as Ferdowsi, Rumi, Hafez, Balkha, and Ganjavi. These figures, though, and so many others, have left us with a vast repository of epic tales, poetry, romance, and wisdom that show just how diverse, colourful, and lively high culture in the medieval Islamic world was in this period. It also gives us a window into how people reacted to and understood the world around them, and what was valued in the art and media people consumed. Rather like today, by analysing themes in popular series and social media trends to get a snapshot of important issues in the modern day, so too does this offer a reflection and insight into medieval Islamic society and its values. There are, of course, limits to this. This was a culture devised by wealthy, educated scholars and consumed by the cosmopolitan elite of the Islamic world. It's harder to piece together the culture and values of more ordinary people in Islamic society from this, so it's important to keep that in mind as we go ahead. It's worth mentioning too that whilst authors could provide social commentary and reflections on their world, it was hard for them to promote radical ideas or criticize the status quo, as often religious and political elites were the ones to fund this work and consume it the most frequently. This literature isn't without value though, far from it, and as long as we bear these important caveats in mind, it can give us an interesting look into how the foremost minds of the Islamic world reflected on and viewed their world and the way that it ticked. Before we properly dive in, I must absolutely stress that this is a very brief overview of the world of Persian literature and is meant as an introduction for those unfamiliar with the topic. The authors and works I'm discussing today have been studied for centuries and frankly could have an entire podcast of their own devoted just to their works and its themes. Indeed, I had to split this into a two-part series because I just couldn't cover everything in one episode alone. I will try to be as comprehensive as I can, but if anything interested you today, or if you are familiar with Persian and broader Islamic literature, and want me to cover anything specifically in future episodes, please do reach out to us at IHSHG, and I would be delighted to do something in more depth. So, without further ado, let's dive in. We'll begin by exploring why Persian literature became such a massive cultural phenomenon in the Middle Ages. And the reason for this can be traced back to two key factors: the survival of the Persian language after the Islamic conquest, and the rise of Sufism that inspired the work of a broad variety of our authors. Both of these things had their roots in the 9th and 10th centuries, when the Abbasid Caliphate dominated the Islamic world and ushered in an era of unprecedented scholarship and wealth. And both of these things rose to new heights in the more militant later medieval period, as smaller successor dynasties like the Seljuks, Zangids, Mamluks, Mongols, and Timurids funded arts and culture as a way of showing their power and influence. We'll discuss Sufism in more depth in our next episode. So for now, let's talk about the rise of Persian as a language and the origins of literature in the Islamic world. Persia, in what is today Iran, is unique. Unlike many other countries conquered by the early Arabs that assimilated into Arabic culture and took on Arabic as their own tongue, Persia managed to keep its own language and even went as far as to influence the broader Islamic world with its unique and developed cultural ideas that were thousands of years old even during the medieval period. Why this was the case is still a point of some contention, although the prevailing theory is that in the east of Iran, traditional Persian poetry, written in the Persian language, saw a revival from local lords who wanted to distinguish themselves from the conquering Arabs. This became wildly popular and gradually spread further west, even taken on by early Arab dynasties such as the Umayyads, as it had become such an enormous cultural sensation in this period. This continued even more strongly under the Abbasids, as a large number of Persian scholars contributed to the political and cultural life of the new dynasty. Something not at all surprising, given the Abbasids came originally from Khorasan, a region in eastern Iran. Examples of this include the Barmakids, who served as a successful family of wazirs until the 830s, and scientists such as El-Biruni and Ibn Sina, all of whom helped shape the thriving scientific and cultural achievements the Abbasids are still famous for today. This placed Persian scholars in high demand as artists, scholars, and political administrators, and this demand didn't at all diminish under successive dynasties afterwards, where more militant powers such as the Seljuks wanted Persian scholars to give their states legitimacy. This also had the curious effect of raising Persian as a language of the elites, spoken across the Islamic world from the Middle East to India. Arabic and Persian in the medieval Islamic world were a bit like Latin and Greek in the Roman Empire, languages spoken by an educated, cosmopolitan elite that created a shared culture across different countries. Just like it was vital for educated Romans to learn Tacitus, Cicero, and Plato, so it was that the elite of the Islamic world were expected to be conversant in the poetry and epics of the Persian world, as well as the Quran and Hadith. This was also something that later dynasties could use to prove their credentials as worthy leaders. The Seljuks, for example, were avid patrons and consumers of Persian literature, as they were acutely aware of their status as outsiders, as rebelling Turkish slave soldiers, and deploying cultural emblems like this aligned them with the Abbasids. Later empires, such as the Timurids, Ottomans, and the Mughals who ruled India, would also make use of Persian culture in a similar way, leveraging it to show themselves as enlightened Islamic rulers, just like European princes did in the Renaissance with classical Latin and Greek texts. Continuing with the comparison of Rome, this reminds me of the way that Rome conquered Greece politically, but Greek culture took the Roman world by storm. Greece in the Roman world was already a celebrated culture of learning, innovation, and philosophy. And something about their culture captured the imagination of the Romans that allowed them to assimilate and make this a broader part of their wider culture across the empire. I get the impression that something similar happened here. Until the rise of the Arabs, Persia had been a dominant power in the Middle East and Central Asia, and had produced a rich corpus of poetry and literature in the time. Zoroastrianism, the pre-Islamic faith of Persia, had a rich corpus of philosophy and wisdom-based texts. Persia was fond of epic tales and romantic poems. The most famous of these, that we'll be discussing in more depth later on, is the Shahnameh, an enormous epic poem that blends the history of ancient Persian kings with mythological tales including battles, heroes, and monsters. It's comparable to the Greek Odyssey, Viking sagas, or Hindu Mahabharata. Epic stories designed to impart wisdom and reflect the culture of the time. I'll also take a moment to briefly talk about how people enjoyed literature in this period. Even in the highly literate societies of the Islamic world, poetry was performed and transmitted orally, with trained poets delivering their verses in front of audiences who might enjoy listening to them whilst consuming tea, sweetmeats, shisha, or even wine. This was less common, of course, owing to the Quran's prohibition on consuming alcohol, but nevertheless, some dynasties such as the Timurids and early Ottomans took a slightly more relaxed view on this. Poetry was a challenging profession. Individuals were expected to learn 20,000 couplets of ancient Persian verse and 10,000 of modern. To give you an idea of the size, that's a body of text comparable to the print edition of Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, which had to be perfectly learned line by line. And as it was performed as well as written, you had to learn the rhythm and style of the poetry too, and how to present it compellingly to an audience. What's more, those wanting to write their own poetry had to have a working understanding of the major titles and write in such a way that honoured the traditional style, but pushed it in new directions. Needless to say, this was challenging for anyone to do, but those who mastered the art could receive enormous wealth and a legacy that went well beyond their depth. Poetry could be written too, but just like in medieval Europe, books were a rare and valuable commodity, with text produced and copied by hand. And just like in Europe, poetry books were lavishly decorated, with things like gold leaf and silk painting techniques imported from China. With that in mind, let's explore some of the major names of secular Persian literature in topics such as epics and romance, and first discuss the biggest and most famous of all Persian poems, the Shahnameh, by Abul Qasim Ferdowsi. As previously mentioned, Shahnameh is an ancient epic combining the history of Persian kings with mythology, and Ferdowsi updated it for use in contemporary medieval times. It's a sizable tale, 60 to 100,000 lines in total, with 62 separate stories offering an honest overview of the realities of power in the period. It's a classic epic tale, with wise kings, heroes that go on journeys and quests, and frightening monsters. Many of the heroes are classic archetypes. Rustam is a supernaturally strong hero with realistic human flaws, rather like Hercules. And Siavash is a virtuous soul put through hardship, whose faith carries him through trials like riding through a circle of flames, a little bit like Job in the Bible. Faridun, rather like Perseus or Beowulf, is a monster hunter who fights with an enchanted mace and banishes demons and creatures from the underworld. What makes Ferdowsi so popular is that he offers a candid view of leadership. He puts forward examples of poor rulership and family disputes, and showed that it was bad leaders that caused a state to fail, and not a turn of fate or an act of God. He was able to challenge the status quo in subtle ways that didn't offend sensibilities, and revived an ancient tale to fit the realities of the world that he lived in, showing that actions had consequences, and good and evil weren't set in stone. For much of Siavash's tale, for example, his ordeals come from the king Kai Kavus, who gives him a difficult time, but only because he was fed false information and acting as any king would. Even the great hero Rustam accidentally kills his own son, and spends much of the later tales repenting for his crime. It also bears mention that women are influential in Shahnameh as well, and are often better heroes than men. When Rustam accidentally kills his son, his wife Sohrab leads an army against him to avenge his honour. And eventually, this war is brought to an end and settled by the Queen of Kabul. This is refreshing stuff, as women's voices sadly are rare in literature from this period, and it's an interesting reversal of cultural expectations too, that tended, I'm sorry to say, to overwhelmingly frame men as more virtuous and women as flawed. This is interesting, as this is reflected in Arabic literature too, such as 1001 Nights, where the heroine Shahrazad teaches virtue to a sultan who is scarred by a string of poor marriages, and teaches him to be a better man through the tales that she teaches. It's no surprise then that this was naturally extremely popular with the dynasties that succeeded the Abbasids, who saw much of themselves in the heroes of the epic. Like in times of old, it was also seen as an essential teaching material for rulers trying to understand politics, as well as a reflection of the late Middle Ages and the dizzying variety of powers that rose and fell in the Islamic world at the time. Many rulers commissioned their own versions of Shahnameh too, incorporating the stories alongside the history of their own dynasty. Timur famously went further still and had enormous murals from the Shahnameh painted on the walls of the palace. It also, of course, reflected the time in which these dynasties found themselves, rulers trying to carve out good names for themselves through conflict and bravery. Shahnameh also reflected the realities of ruling, the way that even the strongest dynasties could be threatened by family divisions, court drama, corrupt advisors, and random acts of fate. That even great heroes were still prone to human weakness, and that the success and failure of political life was determined not by random acts, but by the talents, or lack thereof, of rulers. It was valued as an honest, relatable view of politics, a repository of figures that showed ideal qualities, as well as flaws to watch out for, in addition to tales of war and adventure that reflected the atmosphere of conquest and fighting for the glory of one's kingdom in this period. Although it was a book concerned with ancient history, it resonated true to the world of the High Middle Ages. And I think it's that allowed it to become such an institution of culture and patronage within this period. The other big names in this field are Nizami Ganjavi and Rabia Balkha, both of which were instrumental to the growth of stories of love and glory in the medieval Islamic world. Nizami Ganjavi was a scholar from 12th century Azerbaijan, working at the courts of the later Seljuks and Zangids, who was deeply interested in the mind and human experience of the world. He explored this through revivals of classical Arabic and Persian tales, as well as works of his own that built on what was already written in this period. He explored ideas such as love, and the pain and joys it could cause, the importance of understanding oneself and developing as an individual and people's destinies, and how they should accept the path that they were chosen for by God. Ganjavi's works are diverse and unique. He covers two classic love stories of the Islamic world, Khusro and Shirin, a story of a Persian king and Armenian princess that explores two lovers who are kept apart by fate and die together at the end of their lives, as well as Layla and Majnun, that explores the realities of unrequited love and how it can drive a person to madness. Just like today, love was an extremely popular topic in literature, and Islamic poetry in particular tended to reflect on the beauty of a beloved person, the agony of separation, and the longing to return to one's lover. Themes that, as we'll see in the next episode, Sufis would use to describe the glory of God and the willingness of the faithful to return to the divine. His works also covered topics of politics, heroism, and glory. His Haft Pekar, for example, looks at the ancient Persian ruler Bahram, who loses his throne to an imposter, but wins it back by travelling to the 7 parts of the wider world and learning 7 lessons to help him win back his crown from princesses of those broader kingdoms. It's a classic hero's journey, rather like the tale of Sunjata from the Malian Empire, and reflects the struggle of King Bahram to come to terms with the humiliation of his exile and growth into a wise king worthy to rule his people, something that resonated with the world at the time, as writings increasingly began to discuss good qualities of a ruler and what distinguished a conquering tyrant from a legitimate, wise Islamic ruler. Ganjavi also wrote an Islamicized version of the history of Alexander the Great, entitled the Iskandar-Nameh, that sees a scrappy young Alexander rise to glory conquering Greece, the Middle East, Persia, and India, only to then become a wise and enlightened individual who founds the Library of Alexandria and patronizes endeavors in philosophy and mathematics. At the end of his life, in a slightly unusual twist, Ganjavi has Alexander become a monotheist and begin to understand the truth of Islamic teaching, hinting at him being an early prophet before the coming of Muhammad. It's a creative take on the history of Alexander, and I feel it may have been written with Seljuk rulers in mind, the idea being that they too would aspire to be first conquerors and then enlightened Islamic scholars, who would then spread wisdom within the empires that they built. Moving on now to Rabia Balkha. She was a Sufi and poet, and is believed to be the first established female writer of the Middle Ages, and indeed one of the first in written history. Growing up in 10th century Afghanistan, under a wealthy Turkish dynasty known as the Ghaznavids, she was a prolific writer of passionate and often fairly racy love poetry. As this was also the start of the use of Persian for poetry and scholarship, she may too have been a trailblazer in this field, bringing classical Persian culture and language to the other end of the Islamic world. Although we unfortunately don't have an anthology of her work, she is quoted by and forms the inspiration for later poets, especially Sufis. These individuals were captured by the way that Rabia's verses portrayed her beloved as the perfect symbol of beauty, and how she yearned to be close to her lover, but lamented that life barred her from fully reaching them. For them, this could be read as a passionate outpouring of the love of God, and a yearning to be close to a divine figure apart from the mortal world, opening the idea that Rabia was in fact a Sufi herself. To this day, she's hailed as such, and her work having a double religious and secular meaning, and her tomb being a place of pilgrimage. Sadly, if records are to be believed, her life had a tragic end. She was killed by her brother for falling in love with a slave, and apparently wrote her last poem on the wall of a cell she was kept in her own blood. One poem by the Sufi Farid ad-Din Attar explains further. The moon-faced beauty struck blood with her fingertip. With her blood she covered the walls. Many poems stemmed from her agonized heart. Where no walls remained in the hammam, so too a few drops of blood remained. As she covered the walls with poetry, she collapsed like a fragment of a wall. Amid blood, love, fire and tears, her sweet soul swiftly left her body with 100 desires. Despite this tragic end, she's one of the best-loved poets in modern Afghanistan, and is hailed as an influential woman in a space overwhelmingly dominated by men, as well as a model of piety. Before we finish, there's one more point of interest I'd like to explore. One of the most interesting, and indeed welcome elements of Persian romantic poetry, is that it's surprisingly accommodating of same-sex relationships. In Persian, there's no word for he or she, but a single word that's gender-neutral. It's therefore unclear in many Persian poems what the gender is of the beloved that the poet describes. In some cases, it's fairly obvious that it's a beautiful woman being described, but in many poems it's a handsome young man that's the object of the poet's desire. This wasn't accidental, or even subversive. A tract on political advice called the Kabusnameh, written in the 11th century, advises the ruler reading it to not limit yourself to the pleasures of just one sex, and to experiment to find what they enjoyed the most. Like in many pre-modern societies such as Greece, China, and Japan, medieval Persia had no issue with same-sex relationships, and saw it as normal for people of the same sex to have romantic and sexual relationships with each other. This is a fascinating detail, and one that I think shows just how tolerant and open the Islamic world could be. This is just a brief introduction into the world of Islamic literature, although I hope you enjoyed it and are enthusiastic to explore in more depth. We'll resume next time with a look into the world of Sufism and the poetry of wisdom and mysticism, where some of the most unique texts in all of the Islamic world could be found. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next episode.